With rhetoric as fiery as theirs, most people would believe that these politicians belong in Nazi Germany. Instead, incredibly right-wing ultranationalist parties have been elected throughout all of Europe. In Austria, for instance, Jörg Eder, who's the member of an ultranationalist right-wing party, managed to pick up 29% of the vote in a recent election. Even though his party talked about putting electronic tracking collars on immigrants, said that Hitler had some pretty good ideas, and blamed the current financial meltdown on black people. Last month, after Mr. Eder died in a high-speed car crash, his former political party released a statement saying that Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, should stop assassinating its political leaders. How insightful. But even though these parties have had incredibly radical ideas over the past few years, they've gained a lot of fanfare in Europe. The Los Angeles Times on October 12th only lent credence to this idea, saying that in places like Denmark and Austria, these parties have fared very well by talking about issues like immigration and the EU's policies towards Israel. And it is because xenophobia has once again reared its ugly head in Europe, people are trying to tamp it down, forcing us to ask some pretty difficult questions. What can Europe do to deal with outbreaks of xenophobia? And the answer is that xenophobia needs to be addressed through the political process. First, nationalist political parties need to be brought into the political fold. Second, moderate political leaders in Europe need to speak out against xenophobia. And finally, the underlying causes of xenophobia need to be addressed. One of the most important things for European leaders to do over the next few years to deal with xenophobia is to include these ultranationalist right-wing parties who talk about xenophobia and bring the ideas to the surface into the political process. The International Herald Tribune on October 17th explained that right now many of these parties, in places like Germany, Austria, and Denmark, are excluded from major political discourse. However, that means that these political parties aren't talking about issues that are in the mainstream, issues like the economy, immigration policy, and policies towards the European Union. Instead, they go to the fringe and talk about radical ideas and spur racism and xenophobia in their political parties. In other words, when these political parties are denied a voice, they don't have to talk about the issues that most people care about, like the economy and basic policies. Instead, they turn to racism and xenophobia to whip up their political bases and get out the vote. However, if these political parties were included into the fold, engaging them in open dialogue, then these political parties would have to talk about issues like the economy and other issues that people would focus on in Europe, taking away more of their time to talk about issues like racism and xenophobia. Also, once these political parties were included in the political process, they could be defamed. According to the New York Times of yesterday, Jörg Eder, who was the former leader of a right-wing ultranationalist party in Austria, picked up 29% of the vote. That means that his party is in incredibly good standing inside of Austria. Instead of ostracizing his group, though, where the group can no longer really talk about government policies and instead just whips up racism and xenophobia, his political party should be included into a coalition government. In doing so, any failures of the government can't be blamed just on moderate leaders. Instead, the blame also falls on his party, and that means he has to spend more time explaining his own policies and the government's policies than talking about Jewish people, racist policies, and immigration, meaning that once these political parties are included into the political fray, then they'll have less time to whip up racism and xenophobia, which would be a major step towards dealing with these issues in Europe. But also, xenophobia can be addressed inside of Europe by helping to use moderate leaders to speak out against some of these policies. This first has to come through the European Union. According to The Economist on October 15, 2008, Turkey, a predominantly Muslim nation, is facing hard troubles when it comes to getting into the European Union, even though they've met a majority of their guidelines. When leaders in places like France and Germany use only the fact that Turkey is a predominantly Muslim nation to exclude them from the European Union, believing that it should solely be European, they only encourage xenophobia on the fringes. In other words, if the European Union's policy encourages xenophobia, then they really can't tell these ultra-wing nationalist parties to stop preaching xenophobia and to stop preaching racist ideas. Also, European leaders need to do other things to work to include immigrants into their systems. According to the Boston Globe of October 12th, one of the problems in Europe right now is that many immigrants, most of them Muslim coming from overseas, go into places like France and Germany and then really don't have social mobility. In other words, they really don't have anywhere to go and they're stuck in low-end jobs. This means, however, that these people are often the people going out into the streets and rioting, which only provides fuel for the critics to use against them, encouraging xenophobia. So on the whole, if xenophobia is to be uprooted, you can't start by dealing with it in the fringes, you have to start dealing with it with these moderate groups, because even though they're more moderate, they still often preach slightly racist, xenophobic ideas. And once those problems are addressed, then they can move on to dealing with the more right-wing parties, which will help uproot xenophobia inside of Europe. But one of the most important things to do with Europe is to address the underlying problems that leads to xenophobia. One of these problems is a troubled economy. According to the Ireland Times on October 6, right now xenophobia has sparked throughout all of Europe, and many times it's people blaming different groups, like the Israelis or the Muslims, for causing the European financial problems. In other words, if European politicians start right now and fix the financial crisis, first by shoring up markets, then you'll have less negative economic news that is often used to fuel xenophobia and racism inside of Europe. But another thing that these political parties need to do to deal with it is they need to address underlying problems with immigration and assimilation. The Harvard International Review of yesterday pointed out that one of the major problems is that immigrants come into Europe and then really don't feel European. They're left out of the normal political processes and they really don't have a voice. Unfortunately, this often causes many of these minority groups to be left on the fringes and to have to fend for themselves, which makes them easy targets for their critics, who instead blame them for some of the major problems in Europe. So on the whole, in order to deal with xenophobia, you first have to deal with some of the underlying problems by bringing more people into Europe and assimilating them properly, so you don't have a Europe that's divided down the middle. Instead, you have a Europe that's more united, leaving less room for racism. And thus, what can be done to deal with xenophobia inside of Europe? And the answer is that it needs to be dealt with through the political process. First, politicians need to include these right-wing ultranationalist parties in the fray. Second, moderate leaders really need to stake out a stance against xenophobia. And finally, the underlying causes of xenophobia need to be addressed.